máme příležitost zde v křesle pro hosta ve studiu Flowee přivítat Raymonda Moodyho. Asi netřeba představovat jeho knížky, ale chceme si popovídat o tom, jak vnímá Prahu a jak vidí budoucí život nás všech. Thank you very much for coming here to the Flowee studio, and please just share with the people who were not able to be today at your presentation at the festival Evolution. What was the most interesting questions which were answered today?
Well, I think maybe today the most interesting question was really about my ideas about religion, because I have never been a religious person. My father was a military surgeon in World War II in the Pacific Theater. And I'm sure he saw horrible things, but that generation didn't talk about it, you know, so. But I've realized, looking back, that my father was hostile to religion because of the things that he had experienced in World War II. And I am still not religious. I have no religion. But in terms of God, I don't think of God as anything to do with religion. I don't think God cares whether we have a religion or not. And I think the way I look at it is that I think I categorize God with relationships, not with beliefs or religion. And that was the one that was most interesting to me.
And how these relationships between God and us is established. Do you believe that our brain is the initiator of the connection, or it is the way around?
No, at the age of 73, I'm quite content with people thinking that I'm psychotic, you know, so it just doesn't matter to me. I was a philosophy major and then got my PhD in philosophy, so I realized even when I was a young child that the world is not as it seems to us through our senses, that there is some very different reality behind the apparent reality that we have. So I think that, as psychotic as it may sound, to me, the idea of material structure in general, including, for example, the brain. Many people think that the brain generates consciousness. My thought is that the brain is a projection of consciousness. And I know that attitude sounds crazy, but it's very well established in the Western intellectual tradition. Most famously, one of my favorite books in philosophy was by George Berkeley, who was an Irish philosopher back in the 18th century, who did the most clever and ingenious exposition of the notion that the primary reality is mental or ideas, and consciousness is the foundational of reality, and that what we experience as the physical world is more of a projection or a conjecture made from our conscious experience. And I've been convinced of that since I was a very young child.
I think your name is very much related to the book which was written and which probably is one of the favorite questions. Is there any life after the death?
Well, I want to preface that by saying that the notion of an afterlife is very difficult for me, not having been exposed to it as a child. When you hear about such things later in life, I first became aware of the serious questions about the afterlife when I went to college reading Plato. So it has been a long process for me to come to terms with it. And for years and years, I just had no idea whether there was life after death or not. Now, I was confident, completely confident, that the people with whom I was talking about their near-death experiences were sincere. That is, they were reporting their experiences, they interpreted it. And I also was aware from the very beginning that it's not a matter of the oxygen deprivation to the brain, because many people who are not ill or injured themselves, who happen to be present at the bedside of someone who does die, will empathically co-participate in this, and they say that they, at the point of death of someone else, they feel they left their physical bodies and went toward this light.
What will be the next, what will happen with our bodies once the body itself die and our spirit? How the process look like?
The body, what is the body? That's one of the big questions of Western philosophy, is what is the relationship between the mind and the body? And the view that is held by a lot of people in the neurosciences is called epiphenomenalism. That is, that the consciousness is generated by the material substance of the brain and has no independent reality. But another equally respectable philosophical position is the other way around, that what we experience as physicality is really just a pattern in the consciousness. So from the time I was a child, to me, consciousness is where the action is. Whether there is or is not a physical world, I think, is conjectural. We only have inferences, whereas we have a direct personal experience of being conscious. So we know we're conscious. What we really don't know is whether there is such a thing as physicality.
I think you passed many interviews with the people who had the real experience with this last second moments of
Yes.
being here present.
Yes.
Was there something what surprised you?
Oh yes, as soon as I started my medical practice, I think many physicians must experience the really extraordinary things that go on during the dying process. And you ask about whether I think there's an afterlife. Well, yes, I do. Yes, I do. Now, at the same time, I would not in any way want to convince anybody else of that idea. People have to come to terms with this question in themselves. But to me, yeah, after a long period of thinking about this issue, to me, I do think that yes, after we die, we enter into another state of existence.
And what the next stage of the existence means? Is it possible that the spirit will return back in some new form? Or?
I begin to suspect that. You know, one of the greatest thinkers who's ever made a statement on the afterlife is David Hume, who was the 18th century British philosopher. And he really was very dubious about the notion of an afterlife. But in his writings about it, he said that the only idea about the afterlife that he felt it was possible for a rational person or a philosophical person to consider was the notion of reincarnation. And I'm not sure exactly why he said that, but that was his position. And you know, at least in the United States, there's this idea that the notion of reincarnation came into the West in the 19th century, and it was brought by people from India. Mm-hmm. And in reality, that's just not the case. As a matter of fact, reincarnation was in the Western philosophical tradition from the very beginning, because Pythagoras was the person who coined the term philosophy. He claimed to remember 8 of his past lives, and he had some methodology where he could get his students to remember their past lives as well. And Plato was a reincarnationist. But again, it took me a long time to come to terms with this idea that there's an afterlife.
And of course, the question should be, is there any evidence and the proof of evidence for that?
Thank you for that question, because, and again, you know, sometimes philosophers drive people crazy, right? Because we can never answer a question straight out because I think that's complicated. Now, what was your idea?
If there is some proof of evidence.
Yes, okay. It's too early to use terms like evidence and proof in connection with the afterlife.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly, because we don't. The question is not that we don't have any evidence for the afterlife. The question is, what would evidence of an afterlife be? We don't yet even understand the concept clearly enough to know what sort of verification could be. So people have to sort of come up with their own perception. Now, I think it's quite possible that in the future we could devise some new way of thinking about the question of an afterlife that would make it a question of evidence. But for now, it's not a matter of evidence as a proof, it's more a matter of what concept are we talking about? Because when you think of the sentence, there is life after death, it brings positive images to our mind, perhaps. We have some feeling that we understand what it means. But in the real world, the sentence, there is life after death, is a self-contradiction, right? Because what death means, if you look it up in the dictionary, is the state from which, or the final irreversible cessation of life. So when you say there is life after death, you're saying there is life after the final irreversible cessation of life, which makes no sense. However, a lot of the big questions of existence were for a long time unintelligible or meaningless at first. And over the period of time, we developed new conceptual ways of thinking about it. So I think that's where we are with the afterlife question. The first breakthrough has to be a breakthrough in logic, not in science. But once we make the logical breakthrough, once we come up with some way of articulating in an intelligible way the notion of an afterlife, then it can become a scientific matter. Galileo didn't call himself a scientist. That's a very new word, really. Galileo called himself a natural philosopher, and so did Newton. And it's historically what has happened is that a question gets formulated first in philosophy, but there's no way to answer it. Over a period of time, eventually somebody figures out a way to answer it, and that's when it becomes a science.
And science and philosophy was, in fact, synergy effects in those days.
That's exactly right. And Newton even didn't make the distinction. To him, it was what he was doing was natural philosophy, which was a branch of philosophy. But because of the kinds of things that Galileo and Newton did, then we develop a mode of inquiry called science.
Maybe a question which is related to the fact that information technology and cloud and all of the significant impacts are making our lives a little bit longer than in the past. Yeah, that's right. It's changing the quality of lives of our lives, and we live in the era where in fact we are in very happy environment, and it is one of the most richest part of the history of the people on the earth. How do you see the future, how we will live, maybe from your point of view, 20 years from now?
Well, throughout my life, I've been very good at extrapolating what's going to happen, right? But I must confess I give up. I think that the world has become so complex and so fast moving now that I don't really have any basis to conjecture what life might be in 20 years. However, I will say this, that as a father of two young children and as the grandfather of a child who's now 11 years old, I really worry about what the life might be for them because, number one, in the United States, as we all know, the President of the United States is now a certifiable madman. I mean, this man is totally distorted. And he is in a position of such power that a lunatic like that could bring about, you know, catastrophe. So I think the world is in a very dangerous situation now. And it worries me. Not for me, I'm 73 years old, right? I mean, I am ready to go out at the next moment. I don't want any pain in connection with the process, but death, I'm fine with that. Ideally, I'd like to stay around a little bit longer for my 19-year-old and my 16-year-old, but mostly, you know, they're grown now, so I'm fine about that. To me, this is immaterial, but for my children, and not just for my children, but for all of the other young people in the world, I'm very concerned about the state of the world. Man.
You are for the third time, as I remember, here in Prague. How do you enjoy staying in Prague? What do you think about Czech Republic?
I was saying in my lecture yesterday, I'm past the age of politeness. You know what I mean? It's like, and many people my age will understand. It's just that there is no gain in just being polite to people or saying things to please them, right? But I can honestly say from my heart, I just love this place. I mean, I came here first in 1991.
Yeah, you have time to compare 26 years ago.
I do, and it was wonderful even then. Then it was Slovakia was joined, so we went all over. And the people, and oh my God. And during that first trip, I was with this very nice lady from the government was appointed to show me around, and she was observing my habits for several days. And one day she looked at me like this and she said, "Oh, I see," she said, "you are a bohemian man." And I get that. Yes, yes, yes. So, yeah, I just love it. And this is my third time here. I was here, I came in first in 91 and I went tour for couple of weeks, 3 weeks, I think. And then came back 7 years ago and back here again. I just love it. I really do. Yeah.
So thank you very much for coming to the Flowee studio.
Oh,
I hope
thank you.
we will, in the next couple of years, possibility to host you again.
I hope so, yeah.
I hope you will write some more
I
books.
hope I can bring my kids back next
Definitely,
time.
you have to.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.